O comrades, for not all unlearned of ills are we already. O school to worser woes than these, of these too heaven will grant an end. Courage recall, dull fear forego. Be like this too with joy will be remembered yet, through shifting perils, by many a brink of death. Toward Latium are we faring, where the fates portend us quiet resting places. There the realm of Troy must from her ashes rise. Endure and hoard yourselves for happier days. The Aeneid is an amazing combination of myth, legend, and history, of poetic fiction and religious prophecy, of the sensitive rendition of personal feeling and the grandiose glorification of a political system. It is the story of the resurrection of a people from utter defeat and despair, through many frustrations and sufferings, to become the founders of a great world empire. Welcome to the Great Conversation podcast. I'm your humble host, Adrian Joseph, and today I am equally honored and delighted to be joined by Dr. Annemarie de Villiers from the University of Stellenbosch to discuss Virgil's Aeneid. Dr. de Villiers received her MA and PhD in classical literature from the University of Stellenbosch, where she is currently a lecturer in the Department of Ancient Studies. Her areas of specialization include Latin literature from the Golden Era, Roman epic, classical love poetry, identity in Latin literature, and human-animal relationships in the ancient world. Dr. de Villiers, welcome to the Great Conversation podcast, and thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Adrian. I'm happy to be here.
Let's start off by talking first about the relationship between nationalism and poetry. Virgil's strong sense of a common Italian nationality is manifest in the Aeneid. He was born in a time of severe crisis for the Roman state. A century of revolution and civil wars, as well as new conquests abroad, ended in the assumption of power by Augustus, Virgil's friend and sponsor. The first 40 years of Virgil's life are also the last 40 years of the Roman Republic. Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, became the first Roman emperor, although he did not assume that title and claimed only to be the restorer of the Roman Republic. Peace and order were the watchwords of the new regime. Augustus also actively sponsored the development of Roman literature and was aided by wealthy patrons and supported and encouraged notable writers, including Virgil. To counterbalance these favorable sponsorships, there was also a considerable censorship and restriction on what a writer could or could not say. Augustus, for example, banished the poet Ovid from Roman life because he was offended by one of his poems. However, it was not mere civility that prompted Virgil to write the Aeneid. It had long been the ambition of Roman writers to equal the Greeks in every type of literature, and especially to rival Homer's epics. Virgil's task was to write a national epic that would link the heroic age of the Homeric poems to the history of Rome and to the present Augustan age. Doctor, my first question for you is whether the political slant, so to speak, detracts from the literary value of Virgil's Aeneid. Many critics feel that the Aeneid is defective as a representation of human life when compared with works like Homer's, because the demands of political purpose and actual history override the requirements of poetic fiction. Do you think this is a fair criticism?
Thank you for the question, Adrian. Of course, the Aeneid has a very, very long history of scholarship, various schools of thought. You might be familiar with the so-called two voices theory, if you will, that was put forth by the scholar Parry, where he argues that if you actually look at the Aeneid closely, there are these so-called two voices speaking within the epic. The one he called a public voice of triumph, praising everything Roman, the Rome that is to come, of course, from Aeneas' perspective, but also the Rome that is already there for its contemporary reader. On the other hand, Parry argues there is this private voice of loss and regret that mourns the collateral damage of this imperial machine that is Rome. I suppose, to answer your question, a lot will depend on what you are looking for in the text or your approach to the text. Do you come to the text with already an idea that this is a very political pro-Roman text, or do you come to the text more as a piece of literature? that would be important for any literary work. I always tell my students who read the Aeneid for the first time, usually in their third year of Latin, you are so lucky to come to this text and not have all of these, scholarly articles and arguments in the archives of your brain. It's a new text for many of them. So they in a way they come with, I almost want to call it a scholarly innocence. And they can read the text and appreciate it without all of these preconceived ideas. But yes, the political is very much there. And if that is something that interests the reader, there's a lot of material there to work with. So you could study the Aeneid and focus to a large extent on the political aspects and learn more about contemporary Rome, learn about political ideas, learn about the Emperor Augustus. But there's also so much else there as well. And I think that's why scholars keep on going back to the Aeneid. If you look at the careers of many established scholars, you'll often find that over the years, I'm talking now specifically about scholars working on the Aeneid, how over the years they come back to earlier ideas and rethink arguments they made before. To me, one really beautiful example is the work by Michael Putnam, a very well-known and established Virgilian scholar who used to be actually quite negative about the political aspects of the Aeneid and the character of Aeneas. And then in 2012, he published quite a thin volume, but to me, one of the most readable secondary works on the Aeneid. It's called The Humanness of Heroes. And he looks at Aeneas in a new light, really, as really behaving in a very human way. And to me, that's an argument that has always stayed with me. I think one so easily puts Aeneas in a very distinct category. He's either, this heroic founder of a Roman people and the kind of leader to look up to, or if you have a very strong pessimistic view of Aeneas, you might see him as someone who in the end doesn't really seem to care and, destroys people and even places along the way. And to me, this argument of Putnam was really very touching, that he looks at Aeneas as a much more human character than I think we traditionally have regarded him as. You often find that, students will say Aeneas is such a dull character or an interesting character. If you look at his great antagonist in the second half, Turnus, he's a much more interesting character. He comes across as a much more rounded character, a more engaging personality. Aeneas can seem actually very, very dull in many cases, almost two-dimensional. But if you look a bit more closely, you'll see it's a much more rounded character who really, and I must say there, I absolutely agree with Putnam, in the end is much more human than we might think at a first reading.
On your point about, Aeneas's character is more complex, I think, than it appears on the surface. And I think we'll talk a bit about how his character gets displayed, especially in relation to Turnus later. But on your point about there being you mentioned there being two voices at work within the Aeneid. One literary scholar, Cecil Maurice Bowrer, in his book titled From Virgil to Milton, he expresses a similar sentiment. He says, and I quote, "The persons of the Aeneid are created and fashioned for a special purpose. They contribute to the main design, and everything they say or do may be considered in light of Rome's destiny. For this reason, it is wrong to treat them as if they were dramatic characters like Homer's. They are more and they are less. They are more because they stand for something outside themselves, for something typically and essentially Roman. They are types, examples, symbols. And they are less because any typical character will lack the details and idiosyncrasies, the personal appeal, and the intimate claims of a character who is created for his own sake." Would you agree with that commentary?
That's a very interesting observation. I would agree to some extent, but not entirely. If we just look at one example, the most famous example, the character of Dido, I suppose one could argue that she may be seen as a kind of stock character or character created for a specific purpose on the one hand, but I would say she's much more than that. She's, to me, a well-rounded character. She's a very unique character, and I would say she's a very Virgilian character, because typically Virgil, I think, would have picked that up from your own reading of the Aeneid as well, he hardly ever gives us a definite answer or a very clear solution to a problem, or even a very satisfying conclusion. And Dido is a character who behaves in the same way. On the one hand, one could see her as an obstacle to Aeneas's mission of eventually founding a new city where he could, establish his Trojan people, and eventually that would become Rome, or from that Rome would one day develop. But on the other hand, Dido is also, I think, and that this adds to the complexity, there's something very Roman when it comes to Dido as well. She's, on the one hand, this foreign queen that we associate with Cleopatra, and there's also a warning there for your contemporary readers, parallels with Cleopatra, which could be read as a kind of warning, and also a reflection of the contemporary times. Look what happened to Mark Antony. He did not leave his Eastern queen. Look what happened in the end. Aeneas made the better decision, or the right decision, to leave Dido, to focus on not his own desires, but the needs of his people, the bigger picture.
Talk a bit now about divine intervention. So the Aeneid is divided into 12 books. The first 6 books tells us of the wanderings of Aeneas and his men from Troy to Latium, an ancient country in central Italy and the seat of the Latin people and their language, and the land where the original site of Rome is located. Then the last 6 books tell us of the war between the Trojans and the Italians. The work opens with a proem, or a preface, which states the subject of the Aeneid and the underlying cause of the action that is bound to take place. I'll read from our translation the first 10 lines. Of arms I sing, and of the man who first from Trojan shores beneath the ban of fate to Italy and coasts Lavinian came, much tossed about on land and ocean, he by violence of the gods above, to sate relentless Juno's ever-rankling ire. In war, too, much enduring, till what time a city he might found him, and bear safe his gods to Latium, whence the Latin race and Alba sires, and loft-towering Rome. The proem then goes on to tell us that a third city is involved, that of Carthage, favored by the goddess Juno and intended by her to be a world empire, but also destined to be overthrown by the Trojans' descendants, the world-conquering Romans. Moved by old grudges against the Trojans, as well as apprehension about their posterity, Juno decides to make things challenging for them. And again, reading from the translation, fired with these thoughts, besides, the Trojan few, escaped from the deny and Achilles fell. Still must she keep upon wide ocean tossed aloof from Latium, and for many a year they roamed, fate-driven, through all the circling seas, so vast the toil to found the Roman race. After the proem, the action of the Aeneid begins. The Trojan fleet has just sailed from Sicily on its way to Latium, towards which the Trojans have been voyaging for 7 years. Spiteful, Juno has Aeolus, the lord of the winds, stir up a storm that scatters the Trojan fleet and nearly destroys it. However, Neptune, the god of the sea and sponsor of Troy, quiets the waters, and the battered remnants of the Trojan fleet is able to land on the coast of Libya. Meanwhile, in heaven, Venus, the mother of Aeneas, protests to Jupiter about what has happened to the Trojans. Jupiter reassures her that the destiny he has promised to Aeneas and his people, shall come to pass. And here we see him uttering the main prophecy of the work, linking the Trojans to the future of Rome, all the way down through Virgil's times. So our next question then, Doctor, is whether this divine intervention from the gods affects the plausibility and the effect of the story, especially for first-time readers. Do we think that this divine interference makes the scenes seem more like charades and the characters more like puppets? Or do we see the inevitable unfolding events as a kind of source of tragic drama?
Good question, and it's one that we often ask in class as well. One must remember on the one hand that Virgil is writing in an epic tradition where the gods are very much involved in the earlier works, classical epic. So they are very much a part of the tradition. If I could just mention one example, one question that will often come up in a class is whether, if Turnus, Aeneas's main rival in Italy, whether Turnus would have behaved in the same way if it wasn't for Alecto, the fury from the underworld, if it wasn't for Alecto's influence on him. Would he necessarily have given in to his fury, to his anger, if it weren't for Alecto? And of course, we don't have a clear answer for that. But on the one hand, we must also remember that the gods can't change fate. And Juno knows this, but she still tries and stall fate, or at least create as many possible obstacles as she can in Aeneas's path to postpone his arrival in Italy and his marriage to Princess Lavinia and eventual founding of a new city. I think probably for a reader coming to the text the first time, takes some getting used to the involvement of the gods, because I must always remind myself, it is quite foreign when you're reading the text for the first time. At the same time, I don't see the gods as mere puppet masters. They seem to, in a way, either guide or then try to hinder the inevitable fate. But in a way, to me, this reflects life in many respects. If you think of, for example, natural disasters, for many ancient people, they would associate a natural disaster with a god or goddess, perhaps, depending on the culture. But at the same time, there is also this realization that these things happen because of changing weather patterns or whatever the case may be. So there's kind of this tension between things would have happened a certain way anyway, but the gods are also kind of pushing a little bit on this side, pushing a little bit on that side. They have their favorites. They try to help their favorites, but they at the same time know they can't change fate. But it adds to, of course, the one hand, it adds to emphasize the extreme sacrifices that Aeneas had to make to eventually arrive in Italy, because he was really hounded by Juno throughout the epic. Not just, during his travels in the first 6 books, but as you know, she keeps on trying every possible means at her disposal.
She is relentless, yes.
She's absolutely relentless. And I think in a very positive way, it adds to the drama, because on the one hand, you empathize with a character and you might expect things to go a certain way, but then you also have this divine intervention. And I think, to me, I often read it as something that is just typical of life. There are so many things outside of our control, and the gods in the Aeneid seem to fulfill that function. They kind of represent those things we cannot control, and also the things we don't know.
Just another critic, Mark van Doren, writing in his book, The Noble Voice, he says, the direction in which the poem points is always the future. Some Roman antiquities are touched upon, but the past is of pale importance to Virgil, compared either with his own time, which to Aeneas was the future, or with some newer time not yet arrived. The fabric of the vision is prophetic. The future is as a vice in which the head of Aeneas is so fixed that he cannot look elsewhere, and least of all backwards. He is reminded every minute of his destiny, nor is any effort made by God or man to recommend the prospect as agreeable. On the contrary, it is urged in terms of its supreme difficulty. The struggle to found Rome will be vast and dire. Happy days will come, but they cannot be now, and even the days to come will have their sorrow. Let's talk a bit now about prophecy and its relation to the Christian faith. Early Christian writers were very struck by the prophetic quality of Virgil's writing, so much so that they called him the prophet of the Gentiles. Let's look briefly now at the nature and the content of Virgil's prophecies. If we look at his 4th eclogue, we may grasp quickly in this earlier work the character of the prophecies in the Aeneid. The eclogue foretells the imminent return of a golden age, when there will be no more war, all lands will have abundance, and there will be the end of fear. A new golden race of men will appear, and a baby boy shall reign over the world at peace, where the sheep need not fear the lion, and the poisonous snakes and plants will die out in the coming time that is now at hand. This poem has often been called the Messianic eclogue, and early Christian interpreters saw it as an almost unconscious prophecy of the coming of Christ. And so these general points of resemblance with prophecy in the Aeneid are quite obvious. A time of peace, order, and virtue is anticipated, and it's imminent, as Virgil prophesies the return of a golden age. So my third question then for you, Doctor, is how does the Aeneid compare with the Bible as a religious work? Obviously, the Aeneid is religious as well as national in its character. It tells of the working of a divine will in the history of people. We have prophecy, purgation through suffering, the uncompromising advance of the elected remnant of a nation, the sustaining power of providence, all these elements that we see resemble central themes in the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament. We think of Moses delivering his people to the promised land. What do you make of this comparison between the Aeneid and the Bible?
Yeah, again, a good question. There was this practice, it's traced back to the Renaissance. Some scholars find earlier traces of it as well, but let's say more or less Renaissance. It was called the Sortes Virgilianae, where someone would simply flip open any text of Virgil, but then most of the time the Aeneid, of course, and predict the future by looking at the first passage that catches their eye, which I think reminds us also of what people often would do with religious texts, flip open the Christian Bible and see the first passage that catches your eye as something prophetic, something that would guide you in your day or in your life ahead if you are looking for some form of guidance. So there was definitely this regard for the Aeneid also in much later times, not just in its contemporary time. I think what is difficult for a contemporary reader is to despite the fact that we are so aware of the gods' involvement, meddling, if you will, very often, I think it's difficult for us to really grasp the religious aspect of the Aeneid properly as a contemporary reader would. We're well schooled in Greco-Roman mythology, so we kind of see mythology and ancient religion in a similar light. I think it's difficult for us to imagine a contemporary reader who believed in the Olympian gods, to imagine how such a reader would read the text compared to us who see it as nice stories about gods in other times. So I think that makes it difficult for us to really appreciate that aspect. But then in a similar light, or that would sort of be I would say, a similar challenge when you think of the Christian Bible. I think many religious readers of the Christian Bible forget that it's actually a great work of literature.
One of our previous episodes, we did Dante's Divine Comedy with Professor Jamie McGregor from Rhodes University. And there we discussed how Dante, who also wrote his epic as a kind of Catholic or a more Christian epic, he saw Virgil as a master, not only someone to imitate in terms of style, but he also borrowed heavily in terms of the ideas about the underworld and purgation and that kind of thing. And I really think more Christians tend to underestimate the effect that the classical Greek and Roman heritage, what effect that has on Christian literature as such. Because you're right, many people who are not religious and read the Bible, read it as a piece of literature, will obviously interpret it in a different fashion to someone who sees it as the divine word of God, for example.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I once saw it was a list that was compiled at Stellenbosch University, but many moons ago, on prescribed readings for honors students of English literature. And one of the works included in that list was the Christian Bible, not the whole of the Bible, but many books from the Bible, specifically because these are well-established pieces of world literature, which had such a big influence on later literature. So we mustn't forget that very literary aspect of the Bible. And the Aeneid was the central text in ancient education for many, many years. So it was, as you've mentioned, almost a default source for many writers over centuries. That's why you have many of these imitations of the Aeneid in various Christian epics. You've mentioned, of course, Paradise Lost, the most well-known one in the Anglophone world. If you also think back to, you go back to more ancient times, someone like Augustine, for example, also writes about how small children would drink in the Aeneid, but he calls Virgil the best and the most famous. So even someone like Augustine, who was, early in his life struggling with his more pagan roots and moving towards Christianity, he could realize the value of the Aeneid and also the influence it had on its readers, on even small children. So it became in many respects this standard work that everybody read and that was almost, I would say, ingrained in your very being from an early childhood.
But let's talk now about the love affair between Aeneas and Dido, which I think is the most well-known part of the Aeneid. So this is book 4. It tells of the great romantic story of the work, and this is of the ill-fated love of Dido for Aeneas. His caring mother Venus has her other son Cupid inflame Dido with passionate love for Aeneas. Here again we have the divine intervention aspect in order to forestall any trickery on the part of Juno or the other Carthaginians. Dido betrays her vows of constant fidelity to her late husband and neglects her royal duties. The torrid affair becomes an open scandal, and rumors of it spread. News of it also reaches Olympus, and Jupiter dispatches Mercury at once to admonish Aeneas to quit fooling around in Carthage and set off for his own appointed kingdom in Italy. Aeneas then bows to the voice of heaven and secretly prepares to depart. He delays telling Dido of his departure, but she, with the acuteness of a woman in love, senses his purpose and denounces it. She points out that her love for him has deprived her of political security and of her good name, and she pleads with him to stay, at least until he has given her a son as a replica of himself. Aeneas, held by the divine command, conceals his own pain at losing her. This is the suppression of emotion as a characteristic of Stoic virtue. He tells her that his destiny is not his own and that he must go where he is directed by higher powers. Dido, enraged, berates him as a false and hard-hearted man who cloaks his duplicity behind supposed divine mandates, and she curses his future life. And this is Dido speaking from our translation. I keep thee not, nor would rebut thy words. Go. Where the winds chase Italy, seek realms beyond the wave. I hope indeed that on the mid-sea rocks, if aught the good power can, thy lips will drain the cup of suffering, and oft cry aloud on Dido's name with murky firebrands. I will follow thee, though far, and when cold death has severed soul and limbs, in every place my shade shall haunt thee. O graceless, thou shalt rue it, and I shall hear thereof, for the tale will reach me, even among the nether dead. When a final plea to Aeneas to delay his departure fails, Dido, still in love with him, decides that suicide is now the only way out. At the sight of the Trojan fleet sailing, she is enraged again at Aeneas and invokes a curse of suffering and sorrow against him to the end of his days. She prays for eternal animosity between her people and his, which points to the future wars between Carthage and Rome. Dido then has a funeral pyre erected, bearing Aeneas' arms and garments and the bed where they had known love. After a last fond look at these relics, she takes her own life with a Trojan sword that was a gift of Aeneas, uttering the hope that the giver will be haunted by the sight of the flames of her funeral pyre as he sails away. So, question number 4 for our conversation today is, what are we to make of Aeneas' treatment of Dido here? Is Aeneas' behavior towards Dido more like that of Jason's desertion of Medea, or is it rather more like Odysseus, who leaves Calypso to make his return home? We are told that Aeneas was in love with Dido and that it indeed pained him to leave her. And what does Virgil mean to imply when he tells us that Dido will later ignore him in Hades in favor of her first husband, who, and I quote, echoes her grief and gives her love for love?
Dido is, of course, for many their favorite character in the Aeneid, and it's easy to see why. She, although ironically, she doesn't really influence the plot eventually. She's kind of a detour in many respects for Aeneas on his mission. She is the character that stays with you. And we've already mentioned St. Augustine before, but he's cropping up again specifically in the Confessions. He talks about how he mourned for Dido when he was younger and foolish, more or less is what he says in in the Confessions, if you will, he was mourning for Dido. She is a character that stays with you, and Virgil also cleverly makes the reader stay with Dido. There's this very poignant passage when she looks at the Trojans from above. She sees them preparing their fleet, and then Virgil addresses her in apostrophe, and he says, "What were you thinking when you were watching them?" Which to me says a lot also about Virgil's ability to create these rounded characters, which gets back to one of your earlier questions, where I said perhaps some characters, someone like Aeneas, could be seen as more of a stock character, or a character created for a specific purpose. Dido, I would definitely say, is a character in her own right. And because Virgil cleverly draws in the reader into Dido's emotional state, we are made privy to her thoughts and her feelings. Even her sister Anna, who is her close confidant, does not get as close to her as the reader does. We already know she's going to commit suicide when nobody else does. And for this reason, it makes it quite easy for a reader, specifically I would say a modern reader, to intensely dislike Aeneas and to see him as cruel and unfeeling than as some of his literary predecessors. But at the same time, I think then there again, Virgil leaves us with more questions than answers. We are told that Aeneas was shaken by a great love. After she confronts him, again, I think very clever from a psychological perspective, and one could see it as quite a modern interpretation. Virgil talks about woman's intuition and how before Aeneas could tell her in the right words, Dido confronts him, with the fact that he's going to leave. She has this very, very powerful monologue. Basically, he doesn't really get to say anything initially. And when he then watches her go, she's described as literally removing herself from his eyesight. We are told that he is shaken by a great love, but despite this, he follows the orders of the gods. So we are given these little clues regarding Aeneas' own feelings, although we are much more aware of Dido's intense love for Aeneas from very early on. We are left these clues that Aeneas did feel something for her, and again, when he sees her in the underworld, he's actually the one weeping. She's cold and unfeeling as he appears. When Dido's sister Anna tries to persuade him to stay for a bit, he's described as this unmoving oak. And then in the underworld, Dido is the unmoving one, who's compared to a piece of flint, unmoving piece of rock. So yeah, I think we mustn't judge Aeneas too harshly, specifically from a modern perspective. I wouldn't say he's like a Jason. One could argue that Jason abandons Medea very much for reasons of his own self-preservation. He's really just looking out for himself. He could be
Yes.
definitely seen as quite selfish and also quite cowardly. Aeneas tells Dido his real love is actually Italy, his fatherland, or fatherland to be. And of course, the Latin word for love, amor, if you read it backwards, is Roma, the city of Rome. So I would say there's quite deliberate wordplay there. So I wouldn't judge Aeneas too harshly, although I have to confess, as a student, when I read the Aeneid for the first time, I also had an intense dislike of Aeneas and the whole way he handled the situation. Also, when he sees Dido in the underworld and is quite surprised, one tends to think, but how can you be so surprised? She did give you all kinds of clues that she wouldn't want to go on living once you've left, or were on your way. So could you really be this surprised? Could you not see the effect you had on her? But I think looking at the epic again more holistically, not just reading book 4, but reading all 12 of the books, I think one also realizes that Aeneas in a way has become so used to loss. He's actually also, he becomes really quite a tragic character in many respects, not necessarily in the ancient sense of the word, but in the modern sense of the word. If you think of, how we are really concerned in modern times with happiness, personal well-being, Aeneas seems to have very little of that. There's very little joy if I can use that word, in his life. And even when he, when he prepares for his duel with Turnus in book 12, and he says goodbye to his son, well, not goodbye, but he hopefully not goodbye from his perspective, but when he hugs his son before that duel, he's fully armed. There's that distance between father and son that is, it's a very real physical or tangible distance created by this armor that Aeneas is wearing. But also on a metaphorical level, it again suggests this distance between Aeneas and things that one would imagine should be bringing him joy. Obviously, he loves his son.
Let's talk now a little bit about The Descent to Hades, one of my favorite books. As book 6 opens, the Trojans finally reach Italy. Here, Aeneas consults the Sibyl, or the prophetess of Apollo. The Sibyl agrees to guide Aeneas to Hades if he will first pluck the golden bough that is hidden in a nearby grove. Aeneas leads a search party and succeeds in finding the golden bough and bringing it to the Sibyl, who thereupon leads him down to Hades. And then here, a little bit later on, as we've already discussed, in the Morning Fields, we meet the souls who have died from unrequited love. Among them, Dido, the queen of Carthage. And, when Aeneas greets her lovingly and tells her he's terribly sorry for having been the cause of her eternal damnation, she simply gives him despite being in the sort of hell, she gives him the cold shoulder and ignores him. The Sibyl then explains the topography of the underworld to Aeneas. Aeneas and the Sibyl come to a crossroads where one fork leads to Tartarus, the abode of the damned, and the other to Elysium, the abode of the blessed. And the prophetess explains to Aeneas that those who have committed sins that were not atoned for on earth must suffer terrible punishments in Tartarus, which teaches the eternal lesson, and I quote, "Learn justice and spurn not the gods." But one piece of interesting imagery is that we find at the end of book 6. Book 6 ends with a strange image of gates of horn and ivory, which has intrigued readers over the centuries. And I think I'll just read here from the translation. There are twin gates of sleep, whereof the one of horn is rumored, and real spirits thereby win easy outlet, and one finished fair of gleaming ivory, but false dreams are then sent by the mains to the world above. There were these words, Anchises, following forth his son and the Sibyl, sees them pass out of the ivory gate. My fifth question then is, what does Aeneas's departure from Hades through the ivory gate of dreams tell us? What meaning or sort of cluster of meanings is Virgil trying to imply through the image of the gates of horn and ivory?
That is one of the questions that has been puzzling scholars for literally centuries, I would say. That is a very, very difficult question to answer. I often find in many passages, and especially this one, I'm still not quite sure what Virgil was thinking or trying to tell us. But there are some interesting ways to read this particular passage, and I'll mention some of them and then also just give you my own thoughts on this particular passage. Some scholars would argue that Aeneas exits via the ivory gate of so-called false dreams because he is simply not a shade. If so-called true shades or then real shades in the Latin, it's vera umbra. If the gate of horn is where real shades can exit, someone with a physical body can simply not exit there. So there is an argument that the word there, true or real shades, that the word true or real there highlights the fact that Aeneas cannot exit via the gate of horn. He's not a so-called real shade. He's a person of flesh and blood. So that is one argument. Other scholars read it as somewhat prophetic. The fact that Aeneas should enter via the ivory gate, where false dreams go into the world above. They see it as prophetic, arguing that when one reads the last 6 books of the Aeneid, Aeneas doesn't seem to remember anything that his father told him in the underworld, especially when you get to the very end of the epic, and he does not spare the vanquished, as his father asked him deliberately or instructed him deliberately in the underworld. Yeah, so a challenge on the one hand is, of course, translation, or a challenge to a reader not familiar with the original. Translators could use different terms, perhaps English synonyms, but they do not necessarily reflect the Latin as closely. So if one goes back to the Latin and looks at the exact words that Virgil uses to describe these two gates, there are things that stand out. And this scholar, which I referred to earlier, specifically looks at the fact that Virgil is not referring to true shades and false shades. He actually says in the Latin the vera umbra and the falsa insomnia. So true shades, or then real shades, you could translate it in different ways, versus false dreams. And shades and dreams are, of course, not the same thing. So this, the way that Virgil describes the two gates here, those entities, let's call them that, which may exit via the gate of horn and those which may exit via the gate of ivory, aren't necessarily referred to as being the exact same thing or entity. So I think that's an important point to note.
There is something that the ordinary reader feels that there's a suggestion in what Aeneas has seen is something. It's something like a dream, even if not a false dream. And despite all Virgil's statements of religious belief and his trust in the Roman mission, he seems to be not entirely free from doubt and uncertainty as to wonder whether the destiny of Roman history has not some sort of doesn't share some of the sort of the passing or fleeting nature of a dream. So I think this haunting uncertainty, that affects Virgil, also it might be something that Virgil is telling us through this imagery.
Yeah, I would say there's a deliberate uncertainty that Virgil creates on the part of the reader. And as you've mentioned, Aeneas does seem to struggle even after this trip to the underworld where he saw his father and he was inflamed with love for things to come. He still seems to struggle with this mission. He sort of does what he has to do, but one finds that he often seems to be still a bit uncertain in many situations. And of course, his father early in the epic was an important guide to him, was his go-to person for advice, and he lost him. Now he sees him in the underworld. He's given all kinds of advice and instruction on what is to come. He's shown the future, which then inspires him, but still it's not an easy journey once he gets to Italy to establish his people there, and he's met with many challenges in the last 6 books as well. Now, another thing that I could perhaps mention, also this is not my own idea, but which I've read in a recent article, is the scholar makes quite a bit of the appearance of these gates, and that Aeneas exits via the very shiny, the very polished ivory gate, because it is associated with light and the world above. In the underworld, you'll know throughout book 6 we are confronted with shade and darkness. So there's something light, there's something more worldly, if you will, about the shining ivory gate. There's a lightness there. It's not the darkness or the dull color that one would associate with horn. Then just to give you my own very rough thoughts on Aeneas's exit via this gate of ivory, I think in conjunction with that argument on the false dreams and the fact that one could read the shining ivory gate as being reflective of the world above, that is the only way for someone of flesh and blood perhaps to go to the world above, I would also argue that Aeneas's exit via the gate of ivory comments on the imperfection of the world above as well. On the one hand, you have this very attractive, shining ivory gate, which one can imagine would be much more pleasant to look at than the gate of horn. But perhaps like the world above, you have appearances and you have reality. And the life above is not perfect. In Elysium, where Aeneas sees his father, you have this, this kind of paradise, kind of perfect world. Even if it is, as you've mentioned, a dreamscape, there is something very mysterious, something mystic about the underworld. So Aeneas's exit via the ivory gate, I think, could play into this understanding of the underworld, or his journey to the underworld, as something dreamlike.
To make a broader point about the nature of this kind of literature in general is that we feel almost inherently unable to do a piece of work like this justice within the space of an hour, precisely because of details like this. There are questions and details packed into the epic that you cannot appreciate until only a number of readings. The multiplicity of meaning that's in the detail is so engaging. And I think when you analyze a text in this way, then you sometimes, I would encourage listeners always, and I encourage young people who read these texts to really the detail is where all the beauty and the significance of texts like these come from. Something as simple as a gate leaving the underworld has all these suggestions and implications, and it is truly something beautiful and special about this kind of literature.
Yeah, it's amazing how one word can influence your reading of a passage so dramatically. And, that's why I mentioned translation before, and the challenges of reading a translation is because you can translate one word in various ways. You often miss these nuances that you pick up from a single Latin word.
Yes, now of course we're going to speed along and deal with the last 6 books 7 through 12, that deal broadly with the themes of war and vengeance. Books 7 through 12 of the Aeneid tell of the war in Latium, prophesied many times in the first half of the work, and here we have a vast panorama of individuals, peoples, battles, and councils. Aeneas remains the great hero, with Juno still working against him, Venus for him, and Jupiter assuring the fulfillment of the decreed destiny. But as we've already mentioned, a great counter-hero, anti-hero almost, appears in the person of Turnus, a kind of new Achilles, magnificent in his prowess and valor. But whereas the old Achilles killed the Trojan prince Hector, as we know, this time the Trojan prince Aeneas kills the new Achilles. Another new character is the poignant King Latinus of Latium, who desires to carry out the will of the divine oracle and marry off his daughter to Aeneas. But his plans are foiled again by the divine intervention of Juno, who arouses his people and Turnus more specifically to war against the Trojans. So let's now follow the sequence of events that make up the second part of the work. After Aeneas returns from Hades, he sails to the mouth of the river Tiber, where all the prophesied signs appear to announce that this is the appointed site of the Trojans' new city. He is welcomed by King Latinus as the prophesied foreign hero, who is to wed his daughter and bring great fame to the Latin race. Juno is furious at the Trojans' good fortune, and although, as you've already said, she cannot swerve the inevitable destiny from its course, she is able to bring about terrible chaos and carnage. She then sends down, as you've already mentioned, the horrible Alecto, the fury of war and wrath, who stirs the Latin queen Amata to hysterical passion against her daughter's marriage to Aeneas, and arouses the previously intended son-in-law Turnus to furious indignation, so much that he summons his people to war. Alecto also arranges an accident that sets up a fight between local peasants and the Trojan soldiers, so that the Latins clamor for war. The king refuses, as we've already said, to have any hand in the war against the Trojans, in defiance of the divine oracle, but Juno herself performs the royal ritual of opening the gates of war to symbolize the beginning of the conflict. Forces gather from various Italian peoples and cities under the leadership of Turnus to push the Trojans out of Italy. While Aeneas and Latinus the king are pledging perpetual peace, Turnus' sister, the nymph Juturna, acts for Juno to stir up the soldiers to shame at seeing their leader sacrifice their life while they look on. Someone throws a spear, the truce that was made is broken, and the fighting begins all over again. That's when we have this call, as I've mentioned, to let a duel fight one-on-one, Aeneas against Turnus, to decide the day. Turnus has some bad luck with a borrowed sword that then, again, divine intervention working against him, that shatters in his hand, and he's left with a bladeless hilt. He then runs over the field, searching for his one sword, with Aeneas in pursuit, relentlessly tailing him 5 times around the field. And I quote, "For not light the prize they seek, nor trivial, the heart's blood and very life of Turnus are at stake." Juturna then aids Turnus to recover his sword, while Venus helps Aeneas get his spear loose from the ground. So the two are now poised for the final moment, one with spear and one with sword. Meanwhile, in heaven, Jupiter lays down the law to his spouse Juno, who through Juturna has delayed the desired end, or the destined end. The bound is reached, he warns her. Further venture I forbid, for the heavens claim Aeneas a tutelary god, and fate lifts him to the stars. This settled, Jupiter sends one of the Furies down as a sign to Turnus that the end is at hand. And here again, we spoke a bit earlier about animals as harbingers of doom. Turnus is terrified at the Fury, as the Fury appears in the form of a small bird. And I quote, "A strange and fearless numbness loosened his limbs. His hair stood stiff with horror, the voice stuck in his throat." Juturna, grief-stricken, wishes now that she were mortal, so that she could now join her doomed brother in the underworld. Aeneas then taunts Turnus to come out, and Turnus replies manfully, Thy fiery words, fierce man, affright me not. The gods and adverse Jove affright me. When he tries to then throw a huge stone at Aeneas, he is paralyzed and reduced to a dreamlike impotence by the fury's spell. Aeneas brings down his foe with one throw of the spear. Turnus acknowledges himself vanquished and begs for the victor's mercy, and he begs for Aeneas for the gift of life now that the battle is over. Aeneas is at first half-minded to grant this request until he sees the fatal badge of Pallas, Pallas being the son of Evander, who is one of the allies of Aeneas, hanging as a kind of trophy of conflict around Turnus's shoulder. Aeneas, in furious revenge and sorrow, renders the death stroke to Turnus for Pallas. Pallas deals this blow, he tells Turnus, and I quote, "Then the warrior's limbs grow chilled and slackened, and the spirit flies, moaning indignant, to the shades below." And this is how we end Virgil's Aeneid. Now, for our final question, and perhaps our biggest question, is Aeneas a heroic character? Now that we've seen all this warfare, we've seen his wanderings, some readers object to Virgil's portrait of Aeneas as being too passive, all his actions being initiated by the gods, constantly reinforced by their support, and ultimately winning out through the unfair hamstringing of his opponent. Is this the way we think of Aeneas, and is Turnus a more nobler character in a way, a man who is doomed by the will of the gods and yet still fights one-on-one with Aeneas?
Difficult question, Adrian. A lot will depend on what we regard as a hero, of course, and that depends also on the time we live in or the framework we are using. Are we talking about the traditional epic hero, or are we talking about perhaps what we would regard as a hero nowadays? So, difficult question to give you a simple answer. I want to get back to a book I referred to earlier in our discussion, the book by Michael Putnam called The Humanist of Heroes. And to me, that's really one of the most convincing readings of the end of the epic. As you know, we've mentioned, it can come across as quite a shocking, even abrupt ending. I know sometimes when you read it, obviously for the first time, if you if you don't know how it ends, I find that students would say they want to turn the page. You know, is there more? Is this now it? It could come across as quite an abrupt ending, and there's sort of no relief after this ending. If you think of the ending of the Iliad, it ends with the funeral games for Hector, so there is some relief for the mourners. Here you just have this very abrupt ending, and our final image of Aeneas is of a man burying his sword in the chest of an opponent who has surrendered and who has very poignantly referred to his own father. Turnus says to Aeneas, they can see that I've surrendered. Please return me to my father. He's old. Think of your own father. And that's precisely where one would imagine Aeneas would think back to his father's advice that he received in the underworld. Spare the vanquished. And he does not. But then we are given a reason for his reaction. And that is a reference to the young man Pallas, who of course very much functions as a parallel for Patroclus. So towards the very end, we see Aeneas, who has throughout been this, well, mostly, not always, but mostly very stoic, more Hector-like character, becomes a more Achilles-like character. And Pallas functions as Aeneas's Patroclus to a large extent. And in that very, very final scene, Turnus, whom we've come to know as, you've mentioned, as almost a second Achilles, he becomes more the Hector-like figure, the more sympathetic one. And then the epic ends very dramatically with the word shades. Is that sense of darkness. It's not a bright, happy ending. I'm risking sounding silly now, but it ends on a dark note, literally and figuratively.
This question of the heroic character is something we've dealt with in previous episodes, and there is a disjunction between the classical conception of the hero as someone who is very jealous of his fame and honor. It's not just that they verge on the edge of being a warmonger, but it's that they also want the fame and honor associated with courage, but courage in the traditional masculine sense of being able to find one's way in terms of warfare. But I think if we come to the more modern or the more Christian concepts of heroism, we We saw, for example, in Milton's Paradise Lost, where Milton speaks out against this type of heroism, where he tries to distinguish between fame, which is the reputation that other men give you, versus honor, which is the sort of self-consciousness of virtue, apart from the external goods that are attached to reputation. But I think also we tend to associate heroic or heroism with physical attributes, whereas you can also, as an intellectual, display courage in pursuing the truth regardless of where it takes you. And there are plenty of feminine hero or heroines as well. For example, I'm writing my thesis currently on Sophocles' Antigone, and while Antigone doesn't show physical courage, she shows resolve, fortitude in a different way, which we could also describe as heroic. And so I agree with you that very narrow conception of heroism as a sort of sword-bearing type of character is sometimes a bit narrow. But with regards to mercy, if we can talk a bit about mercy and death and so on, this last scene in Virgil's Aeneid and the lack of mercy that Aeneas shows for Turnus reminds me of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, when he says, "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that takes it and him that gives it. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the heart of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. An earthly power doth then show like as God, when mercy seasons justice." So I think that's an interesting reference, is that justice is insufficient, and sometimes we need the Christian conception of charity or mercy, which I feel that Aeneas is lacking.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that's also what the modern reader is looking for or hoping for. If we just think of contemporary films, the kinds of, let's call them heroes, if you will, that we find in modern films are those that are able to show mercy, or to act in a benevolent way, to not react out of personal insult or some personal vendetta, but to see the bigger picture and to ask the question, what would be morally the best action in this situation. So I think that is what bugs the modern reader, that Aeneas, in a way, of course, does kind of what one would expect under the circumstances, but also we feel disappointed that that's the way he should end this fight with Turnus when it already won. It wasn't necessary. But then again, one has to think of Aeneas's journey to that point, and I've mentioned the fact that throughout his life not maybe throughout his life, but throughout the section that we as readers are given, since his flight from Troy up to his arrival in Italy, and also his stay in Italy when he's still struggling with the locals, he's confronted with loss throughout.
Yes.
And seeing this baldric of the young Pallas on Turnus's shoulder reminds him of all this loss. And I think his reaction, at least I can accept it as such, it's just very human. It's someone who's really at the end of his tether in many respects.
Doctor, I would like to end the podcast on a more personal note by asking you what your favorite piece of literature is and why, maybe perhaps besides the Aeneid. And then a very brief question, if you could, what are your hopes for the future of a humanities education or a liberal arts education more broadly in South Africa?
I like those questions. The first one, that's a difficult one. My favorite piece of literature outside of the Aeneid, that's not that's not an easy one. But I think I'll be loyal to my field of study and my subject. Although I must say I'm first language of Afrikaans speaker, and I really enjoy Afrikaans poetry, and not just Afrikaans poetry, but also good lyrics in Afrikaans music. I think there are some contemporary bands out there who write really excellent lyrics. So I must confess, I really like the music of the band Spoegwolf, and I like Francois van Coke. I think both of those write really good lyrics and very poetic lyrics. So those speak to me because they're in my first language, which is always close to the heart. I would say, apart from the Aeneid, then my favorite piece of literature would be the poems of Catullus. I wrote my PhD actually on Catullus, not on Virgil. Catullus is my first love. then I entered into an affair with Virgil, and it's still ongoing. So I would say Catullus, he writes in a very approachable way for a modern reader. So I think it's really a good author to start with when you are introduced to ancient Roman literature for the first time, because it reads very much like modern poetry or even modern lyrics. He wrote a lot about his own personal struggles in an unhappy love affair with a woman, but he also writes about his friendships. He writes a bit about politics, but also personal experiences of politics. And his treatment of mythology also appears to have quite a personal note, or there's something very, very human and very relatable in the way he presents ancient myths. And he focuses also on the more secondary characters, not the traditional heroes. So I would say Catullus. My hopes for humanities courses in South Africa, of course, I'm biased because I studied literature and languages, so I'm very much pro the humanities. And I think it's important that we don't always think about, of course, the future is important and what you'll do one day. We all need money to survive. I mean, that's just the reality of life. But a humanities course is so important in shaping you as a person. So I would say ideally a humanities course should touch on as many aspects as possible of being a human that help shape you as a person, or after a course produce a very well-rounded individual, someone who has a basic understanding of philosophy, but then also has been introduced to various forms of world literature, both local and international, have some understanding of mythology, again, both local and from other cultures. And I think seeing ourselves as parts of a world community is so important. We are of course we're individuals, we're our own persons, and we have our own thoughts and our own backgrounds and our own cultures, but we're also part of this vast world.
Whenever you take a humanities degree, I feel that the humanities departments have become dominated by the demands for relevance and utility and so on, and that has not been good for them, because I agree with your statement about learning about all these great books and literature. It's so fundamentally important to building a rounded human being. And the unfortunate thing is that most young people, university is the closest most young people will get to culture, any form of enlightenment, in their entire lives, if they don't pursue some sort of lifelong learning. And the only institutions where those kinds of things take place or should take place is at the university, because while many people might see that kinds of reading many people see reading Roman epics as useless, but there is beauty in useless things. And I always preach that. It's a difficult message to preach, but I think it's an important one. And that's why I want to say thank you again for you today. You and I, in our small way, have today again contributed to furthering this mission of explaining why the humanities is so incredibly important. And I think anyone who reads any of these great books cannot be helped but be moved by this literature to see it's more than its eternal significance. So thank you very much. That's unfortunately all we have time for today on the Great Conversation podcast. Thank you again for sharing some of your valuable time and expertise with us today to help enlighten us. To our listeners at home, please remember to subscribe to the podcast, and do not forget to share it with friends and family who may have a potential interest in great literature. Dr. Annemarie de Villiers, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I enjoyed it.